Administration has made it very clear that they intend to decarbonize, setting their so-called clean energy goals, which many are saying are, well, a tad unattainable, lofty, or magical, as you would like to say. And we're seeing a similar phenomenon in Europe. But addressing this criticism from Republicans, President Biden made a recent speech trying to rebut it. So I want to play this clip and then get your response on the other side.
I know my Republican friends claim we're not producing enough oil, and I'm limiting oil production. Quite frankly, that's nonsense. Here's the truth. Just this month, America produced 12 million barrels of oil per day. That's the highest, that's higher than average under my predecessor. And we're on track to set a new record for production next year. Plus, I've added to that supply of oil by releasing a record 1 million barrels of oil per day from what's called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. In fact, I just led the world to coordinate the largest release of global oil reserves in history, including from other countries. In total, that's 240 million barrels to boost global supply. And Republicans falsely claim that I'm blocking production on federal lands. But again, that's nonsense. Industry has more approved permits for production on federal lands than they can possibly use. That's a fact.
All right, we want to be fair here on Kitco. So, Michael, what do you say to that?
Well, I wrote recently about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and I called the actions of the executive administration a folly. And I believe it is a folly. You know, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was put in place following the Arab embargoes, following the inflation of the 1970s, when the U.S. came to realize we're dependent on foreign oil, we're dependent on foreign powers that may not always have our interests at heart. The result of that was to create the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Its purpose was to provide a buffer to an anticipation of the potential of a substantial, significant supply disruption that would greatly impact the U.S. economy. It was never intended as a means of price control. It was never intended as a political tool to, by easing the pain at the pump, to help one political party over another. Never in the history of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has there been more than 30 million barrels released in any given year. In the mid-1990s, President Clinton authorized a release for certain amounts. His own Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, came out and made this point that this is not something that should be used for political purposes. It's something that should be used for the nation's national interest. President Biden has said that he will release 180 million barrels of oil. He had already released a significant portion, it's 30 or 50, I forget which, in November of last year. The net effect of all that, if he follows through on it, it's very clear he intends to, is going to be to reduce the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to basically half capacity, to a point that would require an additional level of clearance under the authorization to go any further than that. But it's extremely dangerous. So basically what we're doing is draining our reserve, the national reserve, in advance of any real emergency. Now, gasoline prices, it's a problem, and we're all feeling it, we're all suffering from it. I'm not a fan of high gas prices, but I would argue that the reserve is a strategic asset, not an economic asset. We are using something that we may need in the future shortly in a real emergency. And the irony of it is it actually isn't helping prices at the pump. It actually isn't helping supplies. If you look at supplies in the U.S., that oil supplies are actually going down. I saw today that Cushing is just reportedly above its operational level and will have to replenish. But the irony will be that if a year from now we have to replenish the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at a higher price than what we were able to realize it from it today, after it was filled under President Trump at one of the lowest levels in time. So during the preceding few years, the reserve was topped up, it was maintained at a high level. And again, in an era where oil was quite low, retail gas prices were below $2. Here we are now draining it, and we're going to have to fill it when gas may be as high as $10. Lunacy.
All right, so you're saying that this is actually putting the U.S. in a potentially more precarious position for the future if we're tapping a reserve when we don't really need to be tapping into it just